In this presentation, we'll overview the main steps in survey research, but we'll spend most of the time on designing survey questions. This presentation will be helpful for this week's discussion board and assignment. The first two steps are to decide the mode of data collection and choose your sampling frame, or the list of your population. Once you know how you will collect your data, say face-to-face or using an online survey, you can then start constructing your questionnaire. You always want to pre-test your questionnaire in case you need to change anything, because once you start collecting data on a survey, you can't change the questions, so it's really important to pilot or pre-test it. On the right side of the figure, once you have your sampling frame, you design and select your sample. So you've done something similar to this on the past exam. Next, you recruit participants and complete the questionnaire. And lastly, once you have all the questionnaires returned or submitted, you code and edit data. This last step we'll discuss in further detail in the chapter on quantitative data analysis. So let's look at this process using an example. Let's say you wanted to replicate Dr. Bro's study on sports participation and academic achievement here at Bloomfield College. So remember, this was a study discussed in previous chapters. So for the mode of data collection, number 1, we decided to use computer-assisted self-interviews. So these are those online surveys that we can create using Google Forms. Since our population is Bloomfield College, our sampling frame would be easy to find. We would ask the registrar for a list of all registered students at Bloomfield College. Registrar would only give it to us if we actually had a real research proposal and an IRB approval. They don't hand out a list of registered students this easily. So from this list, we'll select a random sample, and then we will send an email to students in our sample with a link to the survey. Since online surveys have very low response rates, we'll likely have to send an email multiple times to get a high enough response. Then, at the end, once we have enough of a response rate, we stop the survey and we begin coding and editing data for analysis. Let me pause here to explain how this week and next week's content will prepare you for the second exam. So in this class, you're not conducting a full research project, but rather you're writing a proposal for one as a final exam. So the proposal will include collecting data through surveys, this chapter, and through interviews, our next chapter. So you can follow the steps described in the previous slide to explain how you will conduct a survey. However, you won't actually conduct this survey in the proposal. This week you will be testing it, so piloting the survey with a group of respondents, and next week you'll also be testing or piloting your interview. But you are not conducting a full survey. However, these steps will help you write your proposal for the final exam. So again, just to clarify, that this week's and next week's assignments help prepare you for the final exam, because these assignments act like a pre-testing or pilot study for this proposal. So after pilot testing, you'll have a better sense of what exactly you need and how you'll set up your research study in the proposal. Okay, let's return to the surveys. Now that we know the general process of survey research, let's review the steps in constructing the questionnaire. So I spend time on this because it's really important to construct your questions carefully, and you'll also be constructing a short questionnaire for this week. First, you want to create an outline of your topics based on research objectives. So using our example study on sports participation and academic achievement, we would start with questions that ask about students' participation in sports. Next, we would ask questions that ask about their academic achievement. such as GPA. And lastly, we would end with background information, such as age, gender, race, and so on. It's always a good strategy to place background information last. Within these categories, start with easy questions and then move on to more complicated questions. So take a look at this question. Considering this academic year, are you a member of a Bloomfield College sports team? So this is an easy question to start off with, and it also helps situate the respondent to the topic of the survey. So you would then proceed with additional easy questions, such as what sports they play, how often they practice, and so on. And then you move on to more complicated ones that require the respondent to think a little bit more deeply about their response. For example, do you agree or disagree that you face time conflict due to your sports participation? This requires a little bit of reflection on the respondent's part. Before we move on, I also want you to notice that these questions provide response options here and here. Surveys almost always provide response options such as these. So to review and to add a few other notes, create an outline based on research objectives. Make the opening question relatively easy to answer. Should be a question that participants expect based on the introduction to the survey. With exceptions, place background questions at the end. Don't ask sensitive questions early into interview. Allow time for respondents to become invested in interview and develop trust. Group together questions on the same topic. Use transitions to improve flow and motivate respondents. And where appropriate, use or adopt questions from previous research. So use this guideline as you develop your survey questions for this week. Once you start writing your questions, it's important to pay particular attention to the language. There are a few issues to consider when writing survey questions. Let's go over all of them in detail. You'll also find this information in box 8.2 on page 232 if you have the 4th edition, and page 225, I believe, if you have the 3rd edition. So the first issue that you need to consider: does the question contain ambiguous or imprecise words? Take a look at this question. Is something ambiguous or imprecise? Pause the presentation to see if you can find it. And remember, also look at the options. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the question itself. So, there was something ambiguous or imprecise. It was the options. So, occasionally or seldom can mean one thing to one person and something else to another. We would do better to offer precise questions such as these. Another issue is to avoid using questions that have the negative word or prefix. So you want to avoid this because it can be misread, as some respondents might skip the negative word and so answer incorrectly. Something else to consider is also to use simple, familiar words, not technical jargon. Take a look at this question. Can you find the technical jargon? So in that question, sexual identity is a technical social science term that not everyone might be familiar with or share a common definition. We can change the question to ask how masculine a boy acts, and the same for a girl, how feminine a girl acts in different questions. You also want to avoid emotionally loaded or potentially biased words. In this question, do you agree with the president's statement that we should have greater control? So if you believe in greater gun control, but you don't agree with the president, how will you answer? So this statement has a little bit of emotionally loaded words in it. Let's look at another example. Welfare is a very emotionally loaded term, and we have a great example of how respondents will answer differently depending on whether or not you use the term in the question. So in a survey, 2 questions had asked respondents to report whether or not they thought we were spending enough money on welfare. However, in one question, it was called welfare, while in another question, it was called assistance to the poor. Look at how people responded depending on the words used. When welfare was used, 19% said that we were spending too little. When the question only said too little assistance to the poor, 63% agreed. So this is an incredible example to really show you how you need to be careful with your word choices. You also want to avoid leading questions to avoid bias. So rather than starting with a question with do you agree, you should start with do you agree or disagree. You'll want to avoid questions that are double-barreled, meaning you're asking 2 or more issues at once. For example, this question, what factors contributed to your decision to marry and have children? This question asks both about why someone married and why they decided to have children. It would be better to ask these questions separately. Lastly, are response options exhaustive and mutually exclusive, meaning that there's only one possible option? Exhaustive means that the question provides response options that covers all reasonable responses possible. Mutually exclusive means that response options should provide clear choices so that only one option is possible. Take a look at these 2 questions. Which one is not exhaustive? And which one is not mutually exclusive, and why? So you're looking at the options, not the question. Pause the presentation to find the problems. So the one on the left is not exhaustive, since it does not offer options below 2 for the GPA. And the one on the right is not mutually exclusive because there is an overlap between the ages. For example, what would a 25-year-old choose? To review, as you write questions, make sure you follow each of these criteria. Sometimes you won't be able to, but it's important to use this as a guide as you design your questions. To end this presentation, let's discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the survey method. Strengths include that it is generalizable to populations, since it uses probability sample design. It's also very versatile and can cover a wide range of topics, much more so than experiments. This also means that it's efficient, as survey data can be used by numerous researchers examining different research topics. In addition, it's also the secondary analysis of surveys are very cost efficient. However, some of the weaknesses includes that it has relatively weak evidence of causal relationships. While an experiment observes the cause and effect, surveys only allow us to interpret possible cause and effect. So we don't know if being a Republican actually causes one to be more pro-gun, but we can interpret this to be so considering the numbers that we see. Lastly, surveys also bring up a number of measurement issues. Surveys measure what people say, not what they do. It's also susceptible to reactive measurement effects, so respondents are aware of being studied and so might change their responses. Regardless of these weaknesses, surveys are a very strong and popular method to collect data. This is the end of the presentation.